As we go into the panel about talking about what works, I wanted to share with you a couple things that you shared with us before we started the conference. And we did a pre-survey with a lot of you, and most of you replied and gave us some feedback. And so there's two things I'm going to do up here. One is to go through the pre-survey findings, and then two, the more briefer one, is to talk a little bit about how you can connect with one another on the conference app, including being able to send one another messages and to see all of the participants. So I'll talk about that just briefly after we go through the survey findings. So you remember the survey that went out to you before you got here, a lifetime ago? Yes.
I remember.
Yeah, Mac's like, I remember. So let's talk about some of the pre-survey findings. If I can advance the slides, please. There we go, thanks. So we asked you, are outcomes for youth in the juvenile justice system improving? And quite honestly, everyone is divided. 43% of your respondents believe that the system is getting better, but that then leaves 10% who believe that it's not getting better, and 47% who are in fact unsure. And that's the kind of thing I think that is really rife fodder for conversation inside of your teams, because if we're unsure why, does that mean that we're unsure about certain metrics that we don't necessarily have access to in our respective roles in the system? Does that mean that there are pieces of information that we're missing, but that there's work to be done still around making sure that the outcomes are improving? You can advance the second one, please. The second thing you told us is that most states have not established specific targets for improving youth outcomes in statewide plans to achieve these results. That you told us that while 44% of you believe that you have measurable goals, there's still a significant number of people that are unsure or disagree entirely that they're measurable goals. Again, there's an opportunity here to be really talking in your teams around the value of having goals that you can measure and also making sure that, that you're moving towards them. You also answered to the question, my state has a statewide plan to improve youth outcomes. The majority of you disagreed with that, which is exactly the reason why you are here in Austin, Texas today, is to talk about the plan to plan, the people to get together, the right folks to get into the room. We also asked you to speak for yourself and to say, I am familiar with the research on what works. And you know what? The vast majority of you are very, very, very familiar. So this is going to be tough work for the panel today. But interestingly, you also answered that state funding is not necessarily directed towards what works in pretty dramatic degrees. The disparity between 81% feeling, 81% of folks at some level or another on average feeling like they sort of know what works, but then how very, very different state funding priorities are aligning to those different metrics. And I think it's really interesting across legislative, judicial, your JJ agency, and your juvenile justice administrator. I would encourage you, as you have time to go into your teams, to be talking through what do you think that's about? Is it something like you heard in the last panel where it's really about contracting and getting the right people doing the right work? Is there some other thing that is very unique to your state that is the right group of people in this room to start really talking through some of those issues? You also told us that a lack of collaboration is a key barrier to developing your statewide plan. So that one of the things that is really, really important is to try to get the collaborative folks here, which is why it is no coincidence that you're here as a team and that you're here representing certainly not every stakeholder that you need to speak to inside of your state and inside of all of your agencies, but the key core group of folks balanced across disciplines to be able to have that conversation. And that really it's about having all three branches and all the folks working together to improve outcomes. So this is really one of the key things you're going to hear about, not just about sort of how do you make programs work, but how do you make people work on programs that work. And then you also told us that you lack data, that you need to evaluate the system performance and hold agencies accountable. Again, that despite the fact that a lot of folks around the room know what work, that you each said that to the question or to the statement of I receive data at least annually on recidivism rates. With the exception of the director of the state JJ agency and the key JJ administrator, less than half of you routinely receive that information, which makes it then hard to reallocate those funding priorities and to do all of those things that you anticipate. And then the follow-up question to that, the data I do receive, does it enable me to assess the JJ system? And again, the numbers are pretty low in terms of really saying like that data really guides me towards appropriate and important decision making. So, for every single state in this room, the challenge looks a little bit different, but for every single state, it really looks like knowing what you need to know, getting the right people, and then getting a plan that you can measure, that those are really the steps that are kind of the formulation of getting people facing the right direction on this. And so this is kind of the information that you gave us for the survey, and I think that's the end of the survey. The final thing that I'll say before I hand it over to Chief Jenkins is, again, there are some amazing folks here in the room. I was just talking to some of them as we were out on break. And if you want to see who is attending the conference and even communicate with them, here, use the app that we have for the conference. If you are unsure how to do that or feel like you have some questions, you can talk to folks outside at the main table and we can give you a hand. But that's an excellent way to be able to address and interact with folks that are here at the event, and to also to see who's here so that you can check on whether or not you thought you knew somebody and there they are, or I heard that there was somebody here from another state. So with that, I will turn it over to Chief Jenkins, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what works.
Thanks, Suzanne. I appreciate seeing the survey results before we start this particular panel, because the response that said that many of us, when we responded to the survey, many of you said that you already know what works. We already know what Ed is going to talk to us about. So they've heard you before, Ed, or they took the good notes. But then the second part of the response was that we couldn't necessarily say that we're applying in our states the funding to what actually works. So Suzanne encouraged. I'm going to try and challenge. So far this morning, obviously we've had a couple very informative panels that have talked to us about given us examples even. So now as we get ready to engage around what the evidence says about what actually works, those of us in this room, we're told we're in positions of influence. We're told we're in positions of power. There are department heads, legislators, judges. We're at least that's what they tell us. They say we can get things done. So now part of the challenge, I think, for us and all of us coming to this convening is to live up to that. If we know this evidence already, then what we should be thinking about right now is how we can use this evidence and literature and information to actually put in place practices in our states to actually achieve some of the outcomes that we'll hear more about. So we're going to hear from two panelists. They will each go give a presentation. We'll ask that they will save questions until the end, and then hopefully have enough time to engage a little bit more with both of them. But who the panelists are, the first is Dr. Ed Latessa from the School of Criminal Justice and University of Cincinnati. If you haven't heard Ed before, Ed's done a lot of research around what works in reducing recidivism. I want to tell a real quick story about Ed that he doesn't even know. But he came to California, has come to California many times, recently came to California to talk with probation heads and a bunch of us that have been engaged in criminal justice reform around what we know as criminal justice realignment, AB 109 for the Californians. And so a lot of us as probation professionals were there, and we've heard Ed before. We know a lot about community corrections, his research there. But also in the room were some law enforcement professionals, some police chiefs and sheriffs who haven't heard a lot of you talk before. So I happened to hear, on break, I happened to hear some of them talking about Ed's material and what they were saying to each other. You know, that Latessa guy, he kind of knows what he's talking about. Maybe we should pay some closer attention to him. So Ed is going to be one of the panelists. And then the other panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Kaufman, who hails from doesn't hail from, but currently is at University of California at Irvine. Has done in the program of social ecology, and actually that's my alma mater. That was what my undergraduate degree was from. And she's going to talk to us about the research from an adolescent perspective on juvenile justice. And significant about Dr. Kaufman's work is her research findings were used in the Supreme Court decision in Roper versus Simmons, which abolished the juvenile death penalty, and also was significant in Graham versus Florida and Miller versus Alabama, which placed limits on the use of life without parole as a sentence for juveniles. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Latessa.
Thanks, Matt. If it's all right, I prefer to stand down here. I don't really like standing behind a podium. First of all, let me just say it's good to be here and see so many old friends and to get a chance to talk to you about this work. I don't know if you've ever spoken or done any of these with the Council of State Governments, but if you have, you know they have a series of conference calls that seem to last for months, and they go over what you're supposed to say. And when we have those, I pay a lot of attention and write everything down, but I forgot it all in my office, so I'm going to kind of do what I always do and talk about what I think you should hear. They've asked me to talk about, help define evidence-based practice, talk about what works, tell you how to translate it into kind of a strategic level, and do all that in 20 minutes. So hold on, and we're going to start out here. Let's start with evidence-based practice, because where the hell did that come from? First of all, I think this is the term that has been thrown around now for a number of years. Everybody says they're evidence-based. Every contractor that comes to you, every program they try to sell to you, they all say they're evidence-based. No one says, I don't know where the hell I got that idea. And I think we've evolved. First of all, there's no agreement among academics. And I think we have to think about it, especially at the strategic level, as evidence-based decision-making. Not just, people think, well, I have an assessment, or I use this curriculum, that makes me evidence-based. It doesn't. And evidence-based decision-making involves some steps. It starts with assessment information. Not just assessing youth, we'll talk about that a little bit, but also assessing your policies and your practices. Right? I hear a lot, people will say, oh, this is great stuff, but we can't afford it. My first response is, then why are you doing stuff that doesn't work? I mean, we spend incredible amounts of money doing things that have never shown any effect, and we're always reluctant to give it up. So assessment is really the first step. Second, you have to look at the research. You have to consult the research. I always say it's like if you had a heart condition and you went to your doctor and your doctor said, I don't know anything about heart conditions, but I got some ideas. I got them from my neighbor, little Italian lady. What are you going to do? Well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to find another doctor. I want my treatment based on what? Research, clinical trials. I don't want them making it up as they go along. Right? And so you need to look at the research. Third, of course, is you have to have the available programming. And I always say the programming to reduce risk. Because that's really what you want to be in, the risk reduction business. We want to reduce the risk that these youth will come back to the system, will end up in the adult system, will victimize new people. It's about reducing risk, not just managing risk. We can do that. I'll just lock them up. That's the easiest way to manage risk. So you have to ask yourself, do you have the programming to do that? Right? Whether it's in mental health or it's sex offenders or virtually any type of youth. Fourth is evaluating what you do. And you showed some data here of that we're just not there yet. Right? Most of you don't have the data. You don't know your outcomes. You don't know how well these kids are performing and when they get out in school and in work and in other areas of their life. Right? And so we've got to do a better job of having the data and evaluating what we do. And it also means having quality assurance. I can't tell you how many places we've gone in. They spend a lot of money. They get redesigned. They do all this work. And you go back a year later and it's gone. Right? Because they haven't built in the systems to make sure the quality's there. And finally, and the biggest challenge is the professionalism and knowledge from your staff. It's not just about training them. It's about coaching them. It's about making sure they have the skills, they use the skills. For example, in some of the work we do, we've learned long ago that unless you get supervisors, kind of the mid-management people on board, and really make them part of it, the chances that it's going to be sustained is almost nothing. They're going to outweight you. Right? The staff take their cues from the supervisors, and so it's working through these different folks that you can help make sure these systems are in place. Every time I do this stuff for you, this thing don't work. All right. So, what's the research tell us? We have a large body of research out there over 20 or 30 years that has said we can, in fact, reduce recidivism. We have evidence of that. Correctional programs and services can be effective for youthful offenders. The problem is not all programs are equally effective. Most effective programs are based on these principles: risk, need, treatment, fidelity, who to target, what to target, how to do it, and how well you do it. Those are the cornerstones. It's only 4 things you have to remember. Right? Who should you focus on? What do you focus on? How do you help change somebody's behavior? And then, of course, doing it well. Let's start with risk. You want to target youth with a higher probability of recidivism. I learned long a time ago, if you want to reduce recidivism, you focus on the people likely to recidivate. And it's really not a hard concept. If half the kids that come out of your programs never get in trouble again, which half are you worried about? The other half, right? The other half. Second, provide most intensive treatment to higher risk youth. One other thing I've learned over the years is, despite our statements to the contrary, most of what we do is one size fits all. Right? Our programs, everybody gets the same thing. Maybe they stay a little longer, a little less longer, but that's how we stamp them out. And we have, of course, lots of evidence that intensive treatment for lower risk youth can increase recidivism. This is a slide that just shows what recidivism rates look like based on risk. This is a sample from my state looking at youth over a period of time. And you can clearly see low-risk youth, about 1 out of 5 is failing, 20%. You know what that means? That means you have to put, if you have 100 low-risk kids, you have to put them all in a program to get the 20% that would fail. So you have 10, you put 10 in to get 2. High risk, we're seeing 60% failure rates. That means you're going to put 10 in to get 6. So I don't know about you, but it certainly makes a lot more sense to target the kids that are likely to fail. This is results from a recent study we did in Ohio, looking at about 10,000 kids in Ohio, and I'm very proud of what Ohio's accomplished. When I started doing work in the state back in the day, we had 3,500 kids incarcerated. We had 10 institutions, and some of my friends remember Marion and places like that were just god-awful. We have under 500 kids today. We're down to 3 institutions. And we've done it over, I think, not only over a period of time, but we've done it in a way that's very sustainable. And you'll hear more about that later on. But we've done it also, research has played some role in it. And so this is the latest study we did in which we looked at recidivism rates based on commitment, type of commitment. We had community, we had residential, we had institutional. And you can clearly see here significant harm was done for low-risk kids when we put them in institutions and residential programs. Moderate risk, same thing. We did some harm with high. What's that? A different one? Okay, thank you. A little bit different with high, but we also know that there are kids that are going to have to be committed, right? Especially higher risk youth. But when we looked at these data, it's very clear to us that we can divert a lot of kids out of secure placements. And I think one thing we have to be careful about, certainly in Ohio, is that we're not simply moving them out of institutions into residential programming. Because we saw harm. And trust me, I've been to hundreds of residential programs. Some of them are very well done, but some of them are probably as harmful as you'd get in any institution. So we have to be careful about that, something to keep an eye on. The research on dosage is relatively new. Providing intensive interventions for higher risk has been ill-defined for many years. We've started to do some research on this in a number of forums, adult and juvenile. And here's just some basic rules of thumb. Right? We see significant reductions for moderate risk kids when they get about 100 hours, right, of evidence-based programming. For high risk, we have to at least double it. I did some work in Michigan a few years ago with a court up there, and the judge created a program for delinquent youth. And he bought an old school, and he set up a program. After school, they'd bring these kids in, they'd stay for a couple hours, they'd work on risky factors, they'd do some homework, he'd feed them, and they'd go home. And as we looked at the data, it was very clear that he made a couple mistakes. It was one size fits all. He was mixing kids together. So what did he do? High-risk kids came Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Moderate-risk kids came Tuesday and Thursday. So at one little change, he increased the dosage for high-risk kids, and he separated them from moderate-risk kids. Okay? By the way, we don't include work and school and all those other activities. We've only looked at evidence-based programs. Here's some additional data from Ohio. We didn't have great data on how many hours the kids actually spent, but we had total months. Recidivism rates for low-risk kids, the longer we kept them, the worse they did. Moderate-risk kids, the longer we kept them, the worse they did. High-risk kids started to go down. Now, I don't want you to leave here and think, well, we just have to keep high-risk kids over 13 months. Right? Because that's not the takeaway that I want you to have. What it's telling us is to get the dosage, they needed a longer period of time. But I know you can get the dosage in a shorter period. I've done it in programs we've designed. Okay? I really think that's what it's telling us that we have to have. We can't have one size fits all. The what to target is probably a little more of a challenge with kids because they have so many needs. I mean, many of these kids come from very, very, very tough backgrounds, tough family situations. But if you want to reduce recidivism, it's important that we focus on what we call criminogenic needs. Antisocial attitudes, antisocial friends, substance abuse, impulsive behavior, lack of empathy, and of course problems in the family. They're called criminogenic for a reason. We can change them. We can target them. Non-criminogenic are things that everybody has: anxiety, low self-esteem, creative abilities, medical needs, physical conditioning. We all have those needs. They're just not highly correlated with criminal conduct. Sometimes they're barriers. I actually like anxious offenders myself. I interviewed a guy the other day who was a bank robber, and I said, "What was it like to rob a bank?" And he said, "I was so nervous I could hardly do it." and I said, "You robbed like 10 banks." And he said, "Oh, after the first one I started taking Valium, it got a lot easier." Remember this: criminogenic needs and targets reduce risk of recidivism. Non-criminogenic risks may reduce barriers, but not necessarily risk. Sometimes we can't get past the barriers, okay? And all we focus on are those things that get in the way. At the end of the day, we want to what? Reduce what? Their substance use, change who they hang around with, make their families stronger and more stable. Those are the criminogenic risk factors. This is an important chart because what it is telling us is that most people aren't high risk because they have a risk factor. They're high risk because they have multiple risk factors. And it has implications for how you do business because we got to get away from this silo treatment. Right? And so we put everybody in a substance abuse program, right? Because they have substance problems. I don't know too many people that use drugs that don't hang around with people that use drugs, that think it's okay to use drugs, that come from families where they don't have good support and supervision, right? And so this idea that we're just going to create these silo programs don't get us very far. This research is very clear. The more criminogenic targets you have, the greater the effect on recidivism. Here's a graph I put together that shows the correlation of what's targeted and outcomes. And you can see here some programs such as fear of punishment, right? Things like Scared Straight, right? Take these kids down to the prison or jail and scare the hell out of them a little bit, right? It can't hurt. It's cheap, all right? Well, we have no studies that show that reduces recidivism. In fact, we have numerous studies that show that it actually increases recidivism. These kids are getting reinforced. They go to school. They're the cool kids that went to the jail. Okay? Bonding antisocial peers together. Okay? Taking high, medium, and low-risk kids and building them into, sending them to wilderness programs or boot camps, right? We're bonding them together. We call those gangs in Ohio. I don't know what you call them. Okay? My favorite's physical activity. Get them in really good shape. I've never understood that theory. Okay? Boot camps, good example. I remember interviewing a young man once in a boot camp. I said, what have you gotten out of the program? He leaned in my face. He said, I'm in the best physical condition of my life, sir. I thought, great, he can run me down, kick my ass even quicker now. Okay? It's criminogenic needs that get us the effects. Assessment, of course, is the engine that runs effective correctional programs. Most of you do assessment. There are some jurisdictions out there still don't, but most of you do assessment. Assessment, of course, you need it to meet the risk and need principle. I believe it can help reduce bias. There's controversy around that, but I'd sure to hell rather have a tool that I can look at the data than intuition and judgment, right? Deciding whether this kid's high or low risk, because we can look at data then and correct biases and instruments. We can't do that when everybody makes their own decision. And it helps you target risk factors and measure change. There's a number of studies out. We have a growing body of literature now that says we can actually see recidivism rates go down as risk scores go down. Okay? And conversely go up if risk goes up. Okay? And there are a lot of tools out there. I'm not going to get into all that. You know, YLSI, the PAC, the YASI, Ohio Youth Assessment System. It's really not the tool. It's how you use them. If it's simply done and shoved in the file, then I always say, what are you assessing them for? Okay? And so you have to start asking yourself from a strategic level, how are we using these assessments? Are they being done correctly? Are they driving the case plans? Are we reassessing kids down the road? Do we have quality assurance? Because assessment's the engine that drives effective programs. And I hear it all the time, I don't need an assessment. It takes too long. Okay? If you don't pay attention to assessment, you're making a lot of decisions down the road that may be faulty. Mm-hmm. Treatment. Evidence says most effective interventions are behavioral. We look at meta-analysis, we see stronger effects. What are behavioral interventions? They have some attributes. First, they focus on current factors that influence behavior. What are current factors? You're not going to school. You get high every day. You hang around with the wrong crowd. You think what you do is okay. You act without thinking. Those are current risk factors. Versus what? The past. Maybe your father abandoned you when you were young. It helps explain why you're sitting here. There's a problem. I can't change it. It may be a barrier. It may be something we have to work on. But if I want you to be successful when you leave, I need to make sure you have the skills you need to stay out of trouble, to not use drugs, to go to school, to be part of your family. Second, it's action-oriented. Behavioral interventions are action-oriented. And there's no better place to do action-oriented programming than in the community. No better place, because that's where we live. And action-oriented means you're actually learning and practicing new skills. It's really not hard to develop programming inside the walls. It's actually pretty easy. You have a captive audience. All right? You go in, bring in some curriculums, train folks, redesign the schedule, create some behavioral management systems. It's the outside that the real risk happens. And that's why we have to have programming that really continues when they come out. And staff have to follow some core correctional practices around modeling and teaching and reinforcement and so forth. These are the most effective behavioral models. Structured social learning, where new skills and behaviors are modeled. Can you say that all of your staff actually model appropriate behavior, know how to do it systematically? I guess as most of you can. I've been to facilities. You know, I go in the daytime and I meet with the psychologists and the counselors, and then I go back at night. And sometimes I don't know who are the staff and who are the residents. Right? And that's important because all that work you're doing in the day is being undone at night. Family-based intervention. And by the way, structured social learning, and there are ways to do it, we're training on it. Social learning is not a theory of delinquent behavior. It's a theory of human behavior. It's where we get our attitudes and our values and our beliefs from people around us. And modeling and conditioning is instrumental. It is a very complex concept or process. It's not a complicated concept. It's easy to understand it, really. How many of you have children? How many of you turned into your parents when you had children? Right? It's really social learning. You wake up one day, and by the way, the last person you were ever going to be at 14 was your mother. All right? For you women, let me assure you that. I have 3 daughters and a son. All right? And when my youngest once said to me, when I'm a parent, I'm going to let my kids do whatever they want. I said, you go right ahead, Allie. You just be home at 10 o'clock. Right? I turned into my dad. I said things I swore I'd never say. You're born in a barn. You think money grows on trees. I'll give you something to cry about. That was always my favorite. I said to my son Michael once, I said, do I look like Rockefeller? He said, who the hell's this Rockefeller guy, Dad? I said, I'm sorry, do I look like Bill Gates? But that's who my dad used to talk about. Of course, the problem with social learning is we don't just learn good things from other people. We learn bad things from other people. So it's not that, we surround them with good people and they'll turn into them. It's a process where we model and reinforce and support them and train others on how to do that. Family-based approaches that train the family, and that's a key word there. We do with family, we bring them in and tell them what we're going to do with their kid. That's not the same as training them. And how many POs get calls from the mother that says, fix my kid? What's it tell us? They don't know what to do. It's what we call learned helplessness. We have to actually train them and work with them on how to work with their children. Okay? And there are some great family-based programs out there, by the way. And of course, cognitive behavioral approaches that target criminogenic risk factors, right? That get them to stop and think. Get them to practice those new skills, right? Because we think they have no skills, they actually have skills. Lie and cheat and steal, and those are skills. We want to teach them what? Pro-social alternatives to that. And it starts here. It starts by challenging some of those thoughts. What doesn't work, of course, we've got programs that cannot maintain fidelity. And this is important strategically because I don't care what model you use. If it's not done well, you're not going to get any effects. And so from a strategic perspective, you really have to ask, do we have the processes? In Ohio, for example, we've created something called targeted reclaim, and counties are given incentives. But the University of Cincinnati and Case Western Reserve monitor the quality of the programs. And so our job is to go out on a quarterly basis, make sure they're doing it right. So you have to start thinking about how do you monitor that. Shaming youth, drug education programs, this idea we're just going to educate them out of their behavior. I've been to prisons all over the country, and every one of them does drug education programs, right? I mean, what better thing? Get a bunch of offenders that use drugs and have them educate each other about drug use, all right? It's really a dumbass idea when you think about it. It's not a very behavioral approach, right? Getting them books to read, talking cures, vague unstructured programs. Here's another strategic place to think about. Vague unstructured programs, right? We do programs that do counseling. Give me 10 counselors, I'll give you 10 approaches. Life skills, that's my favorite. Okay? What could be included in life skills? Everything, right? And so what you have to start asking programs is to develop detailed descriptions of what they're targeting, how they do it, how they monitor. Before you start giving taxpayer money away, you need to start asking for these things. And quickly you'll see the programs that are capable of doing it from the ones that aren't. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to have quality programs and continue to train people, we have to have structured, well-defined programs. And of course, punishing smarter. And the good news is most of us have gotten away from those ideas that we tried in the 80s and 90s, thinking that somehow we were going to punish these kids out of their behavior. Doing it well makes a difference. This is a study from Washington State looking at two evidence-based programs, functional family therapy and aggression replacement training. All right? Both have extensive research behind them. What did they find in Washington State? If they were competently delivered, they reduced recidivism. But if they weren't competently delivered, they increased recidivism. We've done studies in Ohio that have shown doing nothing was worse than doing stuff poorly, because at least we didn't make them worse. Okay? So those are things to remember. I've been asked to summarize. Who you put in a program is important. Risk is the strongest principle we have, the risk principle. And it's not hard. Would you want your 14 or 15-year-old to hang around with kids that got in trouble, used drugs, didn't go to school? Huh? Why not? Maybe your kid would rub off on them. We would never do that to our own children. We do it all the time in the juvenile justice system. We lock kids up for a couple weeks to teach them a lesson. Who are we putting them in there with? High-risk kids. And we're disrupting what makes them low risk. So if one of your neighbor kids that your son or daughter knows gets sent to juvenile hall for a couple weeks, what do we say when that kid gets out? Go down there and see how they're doing. Check up on them. No, we say, I don't want you hanging around with them anymore. We've cut them off from pro-social people. All right? 2, focus on criminogenic needs. 3rd, use behavioral approaches. It's not easy to change behavior. If you think it is, try to change your own. But it can be done. And it's usually done when what? Somebody's coaching us and helping us and supporting us. It's because most change you don't wake up some morning and say, I'm changing my life. Usually it's somebody, our doctor, our spouse, our kid, somebody's pushing a little bit. And so that's that has elements of behavioral approaches in it. And finally, integrity, program integrity makes a difference. Make sure that everything you're doing is being done well. Right? Invest in data, because at the end of the day, you're not going to be evidence-based if you don't have data, and your own data, to help tell you how well you're doing. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to
Okay,
Beth.
thanks, Ed. Just before you get started,
Stand up here.
just before we bring up Dr. Kaufman, I just want to really emphasize a couple of points that Ed made. You know, you heard him, and remember, we're here to talk about how to influence and inform statewide plans. And I already said we're in positions of influence. We should be able to do some of those things. I'm going to give a quick example. When Ed made the point about engaging for department heads, your first-line supervisors. You know, I'm a witness. I'm a witness in San Diego County when we tried to move forward with some evidence-based practices for community corrections. One of the mistakes we made was not engaging sufficiently with our first-line supervisors. Came back to me in spades in terms of how the mistakes that we made. We heard clearly and eloquently from them. You left us out. Because what happens is, and Ed made the point, your staff will try to wait you out. It becomes the flavor of the month. I'll be here, you'll be gone, and we don't have to worry about it. It's just a really, really important point. And core correctional practices for your community supervision folks is another one. So I'm encouraging those of you as judges, talk to your probation chief, your probation directors, ask them. How are they training? How are they moving forward? Legislators in the room, how much of this do you know? Educate yourselves. This is part of being educated about how you can move things forward. So just my quick little commercial. Now, I'm particularly interested in Dr. Kaufman's, because this is something I've learned recently in my career about the impact and influence of this research on juvenile justice. So, Dr. Kaufman, if you would.
Well, I'm going to stand up here because I'm worried if I stand down here you won't be able to see me, so I'll stand up high and feel taller. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm delighted to tell you about my work. I study adolescent development, and I want to take you all back to high school for a moment. Ready to go back to high school, remember who your teachers were, your friends were, what were you doing, what shouldn't you have been doing, how many of you have ever thrown a spitball? Come on, be honest, thrown a spitball? Okay, all right. Well, you've now all been charged with a simple assault. In fact, we currently have a 9th grader who's been charged with simple assault for throwing a spitball, freshman in high school. He's actually was expelled from school and is now no longer eligible for the Naval Academy for which he wanted to apply. Anybody ever moon? Anybody? Don't raise your hand, I don't want to know. But we do have a child in Michigan, for instance, who's a senior prank of mooning the school principal. He was charged with lewd and lascivious behavior, and he's now registered as a sex offender for 25 years. There are kids, however, who do very serious crimes. There are kids that we are very concerned about for the things that they have done. That said, in our country, we have 12-year-olds who's sentenced to life in prison. This is the type of work that I focus on. And the fundamental question of my research is, are adolescents different from adults that would warrant different treatment under the law? And if so, how do you consider those developmental factors? And at the end of the day, where do you draw the line? When are you an adult? When are you still an adolescent? Where do you put that line? And how does the legal system address it? And so that's the kind of work that I do and how I try to use developmental psychology to guide legal policy and practice. But before we go there, we first need to better understand adolescent development, because this is a time when you actually see the most enormous growth compared to infancy. For instance, we all remember going through puberty, or maybe we don't want to remember going through puberty, but we all also have these huge changes in what we call cognitive development, or in the way in which you think. Cognitive development is the way in which we process information, we think about information. This is also why parents find adolescents to be quite challenging. You all of a sudden think, my child is so difficult, they are so argumentative. Well, in fact, they actually have just better cognitive development. They can think more abstractly, they can reason better, so you should be happy that they're more argumentative. No parent in the room agrees with that statement. Yeah, no. But it's that cognitive ability. But if they're so smart, if they have these new advanced ways of thinking, why do they do such incredibly stupid things? In fact, anybody who has an adolescent has seen them do some of these incredibly stupid things. And we have all worked with these adolescents who've done these incredibly stupid things. In fact, that's part of the research that I've been a part of with the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Adolescent Development and Juvenile Justice. We just conducted a large-scale study looking at kids, and you're looking at the graph here, kids as young as 10 to as old as age 30. Higher scores on this graph mean more mature behavior, and I'm going to walk you through this. The red line is that cognitive development, that intellectual ability. And what you see here is that around age 16, adolescents are equivalent to adults in their cognitive ability. Notice I said equivalent, not smart. We as adults don't always make the best decisions either. But our cognitive abilities are the same at about age 16. So that's it. That's where we should draw the line. That's when kids are now adults. Again, every parent in the room just went, hell no, my kid is not an adult at 16. And that's because there's another system developing at this same time. The blue line here represents what we call psychosocial or emotional development. That's your impulse control, your ability to think long term, your ability to resist peer influences. That continues to develop, look, well into our late 20s, early 30s. I mean, that's a long time. So you see this gap between cognitively what we know and emotionally what we can control. So we have an expression in the field. It's called starting the engine without a skilled driver. The car works, the engine runs, but the person behind the wheel can't control the car. And that's because these two systems don't develop simultaneously. In fact, when you ask your child, why did you do that? What do they say? I don't know. Everybody goes, I don't know. That is the standard line. They knew they shouldn't have done it, but they do it anyway. That's the same thing you said to your parents. Why'd you, I don't know, shouldn't have done it. You talk to a child in the system, why did you do it? I don't. It's because they know they shouldn't. Kids know the difference between right and wrong, but their ability to control that is still developing. And the reason for this lies very much in what we know about adolescent brain development. Many of you have probably seen the headlines in the news about how the brain is changing. Well, it's changing the area in the frontal lobe, the area right behind your forehead. That's the prefrontal cortex, and it's basically the CEO of the company. That part of the brain is responsible for impulse control, thinking long term, the ability to resist peer influences, and that part of the brain doesn't fully develop until roughly age 25. The brain develops, and I'll have this movie for you in a second, from back to front, and what you want to see is more blue. Blue on this means more development. I'm pushing. Nothing's happening. There we go. Oh, we went too fast. And that should go. And it won't, so we'll come back. So, funny joke that's next is what every parent should see, which is, young man, go to your room and stay there until your cerebral cortex matures. Because that's what you basically have to do. In order for these developmental characteristics to change or develop, the frontal lobe needs to come into place. And that's important because that's the part of the brain that regulates that emotional control system. And it's not there yet. Think of it like the brake of the car. You step on the brake, the car doesn't stop. And that's the frontal lobe. It's not ready yet. And so why we see that disconnect between cognitively what they know and emotionally what they can control. Well, unfortunately, instead of being able to send them to the room, we actually send them someplace else, in particular to the justice system. We are actually criminalizing adolescents. Many of the things kids do, they get in trouble for and are sent to the system. A lot of research looks at what gets kids into crime. One of the goals that we started with was, well, what gets kids out? And who are policymakers and practitioners most concerned about? That's the serious offender. Well, with support from the MacArthur Foundation and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, we conducted a large-scale study with over 1,300 serious felony offenders. This study, called the Pathways to Desistance Study, followed these kids for over 7 years. We started to follow these kids to see, well, who stops? Do they stop? If you start with the most serious, most dangerous felony-level offenders, do any of these kids actually stop offending? In fact, these are the kids that are driving all our practice and policy. Well, let me show you the the final results. What you're looking at here are patterns of offending from the kids going from age 14 to age 25 with higher scores, meaning more offending behavior. And I'll walk you through this graph. So let's start here with the purple line. About a third of the kids, these are serious felony offenders, stop offending very early in their adolescent careers. About a third, they just stop. About 16% continue at a very low base rate, but a very low base rate phenomenon. Anybody have any guess what that low base phenomenon typically is? What the most serious felony level offense is at that level? Drugs. Okay, we have a lot of drug offenders in that group. The three groups I'm most interested in are those next three lines, the ones who all start at a very high level of offending. First, of course, is that red line. That's the group we're most concerned about. Notice there are only 9%. Only 9% of the kids who are these serious felony offenders persist in their behavior. Interestingly, kids who start at the same high level as those persisting kids, those other two groups stop offending. In fact, anybody who's followed the age crime curve from the FBI Unified Crime Reports, crime peaks around 18, 19 years of age, and then declines by about age 25. I don't know, maybe we're just too old or too tired to run, but about age 25, we stop offending. Well, in fact, we wanted to see, well, what predicts this desistance process? Can we identify what it is? Well, using developmental psychology, we in fact find that what you see here is that psychosocial maturity, that emotional control system, that blue line again, that impulse control, the ability to think long term, every other group developed impulse control, resistance to peer influence. The only group that did not develop that was that 9% persisting group. They didn't follow the normative paths. What's interesting here is that most kids, if they just grow up, they grow out of crime. Now, this is particularly important because we started with the serious offenders. But now, what about the low-level offender? The kid who's your first-time offender, who commits that misdemeanor. Let me tell you about a new study we're doing, supported by the MacArthur Foundation, called the Crossroads Study. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention has also given support for this study and has helped us to start to begin to understand what should you do with the first-time offender between the ages of 13 and 17. With this particular study here, let's say you have a kid. If you have a kid who is truant from school, he's going to be informally processed. No petition filed, diverted from the court. And if you have a kid who commits murder, he's going to be formally processed, a petition will be filed, and he will go through the court system. But now, what do you do with the first-time burglar? Do you formally process him, petition him through the system, or do you give him a second chance? Do you divert him and not file that petition? Well, what we have done is matched kids. These kids are identical in every way. In fact, we use some statistical matching. Just imagine they're identical twins. They've both committed a burglary, but one is informally processed and one is formally processed. What happens to them long term? And in fact, we're following these kids. We have funding out for 3 years and just received funding from the MacArthur Foundation to continue this study out for an additional 5. And we're looking at their education, their mental health, their developmental, and of course, their behavioral or recidivism outcomes. I'm going to give you some preliminary results of these findings, but I also want to introduce you to one more group of the informal versus formally processed kids. And I'm going to look at their recidivism and their rearrest. And what you're going to talk about also is these no-contact youth. That's a third group of kids that we've recruited in this study. And for this particular group, the no-contact group, they're exactly the same, matched in every way, but they've never been caught. So these are kids who are doing the same exact crimes, these low-level misdemeanor crimes, but the system has not picked them up. So we wanted to see here, looking at their self-report of offending. So we interview these kids every 6 months. We find them. I'm going to show you the preliminary work. This is preliminary from Orange County, California right now. Just to show you from baseline to 6-month follow-up, how these kids are responding on their self-report of offending. How many crimes are they doing? Let's start with just the no-contact kids. And what we see here is they're doing some crime. We knew that. That's how they got recruited into the study. And they just continue on their behavior. No change in behavior. They're just doing their criminal behavior as normal. Any guesses on how the informally processed kids are doing, better or worse? They're doing much better. In fact, diverting them through the system, getting them community resources, not filing the petition, the system may actually do something positive. Hold that thought, though. I'm going to change my mind in a minute. What about the formally processed kids? Doing better or worse? Yeah, very worse. In fact, they've actually increased in their self-report of offending. Now, the reason I want you to focus on this is, remember, all 3 groups started at the same rate. They're basically identical twins, or now actually they're triplets, and yet the only difference between them is the way in which they have experienced this system. Now let's look at their rearrest rates. Same kids, same experiences. They've told you what they're doing. Now what are we as a system doing to them? Guesses on the rearrest rates for the formal. Do you think they're high? Pretty good. They're at 21%. Well, that makes sense. They're offending. They're probably going to get caught. They're doing more bad behavior. The system, they're coming to the attention of the system. Rearrest rates for the informal processed kids. Lower, higher, the same. Lower, higher. I got a little bit of everything. About the same. Here they are. They've reduced their behavior. They're doing better. Yet once snared in the system continues to rearrest them. So even though we have somehow improved and increased their behavior because they're adolescents, and imagine having your adolescents now under a microscope where somebody is watching everything that you're doing, you're much more likely to get into trouble again. And in fact, now we then criminalize them and rearrest them. What about the no contact? Nobody's been rearrested yet. Okay? And excitingly, we do have support now from the MacArthur Foundation to go follow these kids out 2 years later, so that we'll see whether they have rearrest rates so far. I do want to shift gears, though, and talk about how, there's a lot of buzz. I do want to talk now about the family, because kids, and I think Dr. Latessa brought this up in his talk as well, kids don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a family context, which is so incredibly important. And how the family responds to these youth is so incredibly important. But what was interesting here is we actually did a test of their knowledge of the justice system. And what we did here was actually give them a test to see how well they knew how this justice system worked. On a score of 0 to 100%, our parents are getting about a D. The average is 66%. In fact, parents have no idea how the system works. They aren't understanding what's working in the system. In fact, 19 of the over 200 participants didn't do better than chance on this test. Now, who are these people? If we just take the people who are failing on this exam, who are they? They're born outside the United States. They're predominantly non-white, non-English speaking, lowest third income, and lowest third in education. These families are our most vulnerable families, and yet we have done nothing to help educate them about how to help their children navigate this system. Just to give you an idea of the kinds of questions that they are missing, if we have any public defenders in the room, less than half know what you do. If we have any probation officers in the room, Chief Jenkins, I'm looking at you. About a third don't know that their conversations with a probation officer are kept confidential. They don't know how the system works. I do want to make one big shout out to Orange County, California. After we presented these results, they took these results, they have designed a parenting program. Now every child, first time into court, the parenting program is administered. Parents are taught what the system is like. They are given handouts on the information. And in fact, although not studied scientifically yet, they've seen a reduction in bench warrants because now parents understand what a bench warrant is and what they need to do. Once parents are better educated to help their children, they can actually help keep them out of the system as well. So I want to conclude by telling you what the next steps are in terms of thinking about how policy and practice and how we can use this information. For instance, in the state of California, where I'm from, you can transfer a youth to the adult criminal system at the age of 14. Here in Texas, it's also 14. In Colorado, it's 12. In Kansas, it's 10. And in Delaware, there is no lower age limit at which a youth can be transferred to the adult court system. We've already seen changes by using this science to abolish the juvenile death penalty, to abolish life without the possibility of parole. Bottom line, data speaks louder than words. Research can help guide how you change your policy and practice. And so we all hope that you partner together with researchers in your community to use this science to help guide how you change practice and policy. Because as everybody in this room knows, children are not miniature adults. Thank you.
It's just so educational, and I could actually listen to a whole lot more. We wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions, but I'm going to ask the first one, because we've talked a lot about recidivism as outcomes, and how that should inform, how tracking recidivism rates should inform state plans. But what about other outcomes? And this is for both of you. What about other outcomes? What else should we be looking at and considering? Dr. Kaufman?
Yeah, one outcome that we have also looked at, is it possible to get my slides back? Don't know if I can, okay. Is looking at those youth in terms of their school misconduct. So going back to that Crossroads study, what you see here is that about 86% of our kids had been suspended, about 25% had been expelled. And you look on average, they get about 2.5 days suspension. Every person in this room knows kids who are suspended are more likely to reoffend. And in fact, our research is showing they do reoffend higher. So there's a school to prison connection here. But what's really interesting to us is that formal versus informal processing. If kids are formally processed, remember they're identical twins. Kids who are formally processed, they're more likely to be transferred out of the normative, typical high school setting and placed into alternative schools. And the reason that matters is because you actually see less school bonding. And with less school bonding, one of the best predictors of keeping kids out of crime is having them bond to school. By keeping them out of the school system, less bonding to school, we actually have seen more offending. You're creating the very problem by processing through the system. They're losing their educational opportunity and ultimately becoming worse, not better. So that's one thing in terms of our additional outcomes that we've seen.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufman. Questions from the audience? I thought I saw someone over here. Oh.
Real quick, Beth, could you give them the results on that?
Can-
I do have a little insight into this study, I confess, but I'm happy to have OJJDP pick up the funding any day. So I am interested in what you've been finding with respect to the formal and informally processed kids and their mental health outcomes and substance use.
In terms of their mental health and substance use, we're seeing very similar findings. By the kids being formally processed, we're seeing an exacerbation in mental health symptomatology, as well as an increase in substance use. So in terms of education, mental health, substance use, we're seeing it in all domains.
And before the next question, I have one actually for the panelists. In applying what Ed was sharing with us, and Dr. Kaufman with what you shared on the formal and informal processing, can either of you talk to us about the role of assessment, or Dr. Kaufman, the role of assessment in that data? Do we know how the kids and the different trajectories, do we know anything about their assessment backgrounds? I've heard you mention that at least one set was identical twins, but can you offer some background there?
So we aren't doing, so what Dr. Latessa is talking about in terms of assessment, we aren't assessing them. What we do is we do an entire battery of interviews, and then we use what's called propensity score matching to make them equivalent in that regard, so that when we take out, So is it due to race, or is it due to SES, or is it due to, we can take that out of the equation and see just that it's related to the type of processing they received.
Thank you. Question over here.
I have a question for Dr. Latessa on the incompetently delivered evidence-based interventions versus the competently delivered. I thought it was a very interesting slide, and I guess my question is, what's your experience as to what the percentage breakdown is incompetently versus competently delivered, and what are some things that we can do about that?
That's a good question. I think, I don't know, I really have a percentage. We've assessed hundreds and hundreds of programs, and we do look at the competency ratings of staff, and I'd say only about 1 out of 4 rate competent. So I think there's a lot of work to do. I think it's a question of training, coaching, all right, ongoing support of staff. I mean, it's a skill, delivering interventions, whether it's family-based or cognitive-based, mental health requires some skills. And so we often are asking staff that don't necessarily have that skill set to go in there and do it. And so it's really a process of making sure there's regular review, people are sitting in on the group, some places even video and give feedback to the staff. So it's really, but I think thinking of it as from a systems perspective, it's putting in place those elements that allow you to build quality assurance. And having a QI staff, folks that actually have the job of helping folks develop their skill set. Many of you have training units, but that's the problem. They go in and they train. Training's not a very effective way to maintain over time. Because people get trained and then they go back and they say, well, that doesn't really work, or I only like certain parts of it. It's that constant coaching, and oftentimes through supervisors, that can get your competency levels up.
Dr. Kaufman, a quick word on what's your message to me, to probation chiefs, other department heads, is to your research and other decision makers about your research. Well,
I think 2 things. One, you need to remember that these adolescents are developmentally still kids, and so to hold them to a standard that they shouldn't be doing things. It's going to take time for them just to grow out of this. But ultimately, by diverting these youth, by not formally processing them through the system, by using community-based sanctions or community opportunities to keep them out of the system, you actually can have a much more effective and responsive treatment to them, as well as a more cost-effective one by keeping them out. So I would really encourage more, based on what we're seeing with the Crossroads Study so far, the diversion out of the system is a much better alternative.
okay, looks like we're out of time. So can we thank the panelists?